Tonight we slip into the glow of torchlight flickering along an ancient Roman street, the air thick with the tang of vinegar, salt, and smoke from clay ovens. You're wrapped in a woolen cloak, sandals slapping against the stones as vendors shout over one another, hawking bread, olives, figs, and yes, cucumbers destined for a fate stranger than you might expect. You think you're here for gladiators, or perhaps a glimpse of Julius Caesar's toga billowing in the breeze, but no, you've wandered straight into the story of Roman pickles. And honestly, you probably won't survive this, not if you imagine biting into a 2,000-year-old brined cucumber. Still, that's the journey tonight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trail into a Roman kitchen, the heart of any household, where the smell of vinegar lingers stronger than perfume. Clay amphorae line the corners, sealed with wax, their contents quietly transforming cucumbers into sour, salty treats. For Romans, this was no small hobby. Pickles weren't some quirky side dish, they were survival food, travel companions, and in a weird way, status symbols. Just as you stash instant noodles in your cupboard, they stashed brined vegetables, ready to endure long winters and long marches. Pickles in Rome had roots stretching back into Greek practices. The Greeks loved preservation, and the Romans, never shy about borrowing, dunked cucumbers into their own salty brines. The historian Pliny the Elder casually noted cucumbers were so beloved that Emperor Tiberius grew them year-round, using wheeled carts to move plants into the sun. Imagine that, a Roman emperor basically inventing a greenhouse just for cucumbers, like your neighbor building a heated garage to protect their collection of rare Funko Pops. But this isn't only about emperors. You can picture Roman plebeians, the working class, standing in crowded markets, haggling for jars of pickled vegetables. A clay jar of sour cucumbers wasn't fancy, but it was reliable. Salt kept decay away, vinegar added bite, and water carried the tang deep into the flesh of the cucumber. And if you think that's boring, remember, no refrigerators. This was cutting-edge preservation. Without it, armies would starve, sailors would wither, and children wouldn't get their crunchy snack when bread felt too dry. The funny part is how obsessed Romans were with the crunch. Writers even joked about it. Martial, the satirist, teased that certain men loved their pickles more than their wives. That's a level of cucumber romance you probably don't want to experience firsthand. Yet, the joke only works if the audience recognizes the obsession, meaning pickle culture was widespread enough to be poked at. And there's more than flavor. Pickles symbolized endurance. They could last weeks, months, even a season without spoiling. Roman picklers would carefully monitor brine, sealing jars with pitch or wax, testing for that satisfying sharp scent. You picture a woman lifting the lid, inhaling, and smiling when the vinegar burns her nostrils. Success. Dinner is saved. Failure meant slimy cucumbers, sickness, and possibly neighbors whispering about your poor housekeeping. After all, in a society obsessed with order, even your jars were judged. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman doctors prescribed pickles as medicine. They claimed brined cucumbers could balance the humors, cool overheated bodies, and even calm indigestion. Was it scientific? Not really. Historians still argue whether Roman medical pickle prescriptions were genuine health advice or just a polite excuse for craving salty snacks. Imagine telling your doctor today, "I need more pickles, it's for my spleen." The sensory world of Rome buzzed with this. You step into the forum, smell vinegar wafting from food stalls, see glazed jars glinting in sunlight, hear the splash of cucumbers plunging into brine. Pickling wasn't an afterthought, it was embedded in the rhythm of life. Soldiers carried them. Aristocrats demanded them. Children munched on them like ancient potato chips. And yet, you get the sense of something odd. Why did such a simple food capture such a powerful empire? Maybe because Rome itself loved control over people, over territories, and yes, over cucumbers. Brining was domination of nature. Take a perishable vegetable, lock it into salty immortality. That's the Roman way. Conquer Gaul, conquer Judea, conquer spoilage. You bite into a sour crunch, and in that briny taste, you taste empire itself. You wander further into the Roman countryside, where sunlight spills across villa gardens like molten honey, and every neat row of plants bristles with purpose. The hum of bees and the chatter of farmhands fold into the smell of damp soil, garlic, and freshly cut herbs. And right there, poking up like little green soldiers, are cucumbers destined, inevitably, for the brine jar. You'd think a garden is just a garden, but for Romans, cucumbers were practically celebrities. They strutted across the empire's diet, paraded at feasts, and ended their days soaking in vinegar like world-weary retirees at a spa. The story goes that Emperor Tiberius adored cucumbers so much he demanded them year-round. Pliny the Elder, our ever-diligent gossip columnist of antiquity, claims cucumbers were grown in mobile carts that could be shifted to catch sunlight or tucked indoors during cold nights. You're basically looking at the prototype of a greenhouse, all to please one man's pickle cravings. Imagine an emperor whose imperial edicts probably read something like, "Let there be cucumbers at my banquet, or else." Talk about ruling with an iron brine. But cucumbers weren't just for emperors. Wealthy villa owners planted them in kitchen gardens alongside leeks, onions, and herbs. You can picture enslaved gardeners bending over the rows, watering with buckets, while their masters casually debate whether dill or coriander makes the better brine. Meanwhile, in the cities, plebeians without gardens relied on bustling marketplaces. Stalls piled high with cucumbers glistened in the morning sun, waiting for buyers who would drag them home to pickle jars tucked into cool, shaded corners. The pickle parade wasn't only culinary, it was social. Hosting a feast without pickled vegetables was like throwing a modern dinner party and forgetting the chips and dip. A salty crunch broke up the monotony of bread and porridge, gave a tangy edge to roasted meats, and kept guests nibbling while the wine flowed. Romans even believed certain pickled flavors could prevent overindulgence from turning into regret. You know, the ancient version of a pickle cures your hangover. Historians still argue whether that was true science or just hopeful party logic. And here's your quirky tidbit: cucumbers weren't always pickled solo. Some brines were experimental mashups: cucumbers with cabbage, cucumbers with garlic, cucumbers with fish sauce. Yes, you heard that right. Someone, somewhere, thought combining cucumbers and garum, the fermented fish sauce of Rome, was a good idea. If you're gagging a little, you're not alone. But in Roman taste logic, sour plus salty plus funky equaled perfection. Your modern palate may disagree, but remember, this is the same culture that thought dormice stuffed with honey were a delicacy. Perspective helps. Pickling, as odd as it seems, made cucumbers travelers too. Soldiers and sailors needed sturdy foods, and cucumbers couldn't survive long voyages fresh. But in brine, they marched alongside legions into Gaul and floated on ships bound for Alexandria. You can almost imagine the sound of a jar sloshing with vinegar strapped to a soldier's pack, promising a crunchy morale boost between battles. A soldier's letter might read, "Dear family, we conquered the village." The pickles held up nicely. Practical, if unromantic. The gardens also connected cucumbers with symbolism. Romans believed certain vegetables had cooling, calming properties. A cucumber pressed to the forehead was said to relieve headaches. Pregnant women were sometimes advised to eat cucumbers for fertility, though other sources warned the exact opposite. Historians still argue whether cucumbers were sacred symbols of life or just overhyped salad ingredients. Either way, the fact that a humble vegetable sparked so many theories says something about its cultural weight. Picture yourself now, seated in a triclinium, reclining on a cushioned bench while servants pass around platters. A roasted peacock glistens in the center, wine flows like a crimson river, but what do you grab first? A pickle. Because while the peacock looks impressive, the pickle is bite-sized, refreshing, and oddly grounding. The crunch echoes through the mosaic-floored hall, and you realize, in Rome, cucumbers didn't just grow in gardens, they strutted onto the stage of social ritual. And that's the parade, cucumbers marching from dirt to jar to feast, with emperors ordering greenhouses for their cravings and poets sneaking in sour jokes about them. You trail back through the villa gardens, vines curling at your feet, the smell of brine already in the air. You know where this is headed. The jars are waiting. The legion is hungry. The pickle parade never stops. You leave behind the villa gardens and step onto a dusty Roman road, wide and rutted from centuries of cartwheels. The air is dry, the sun punishes your shoulders, and ahead stretches the endless horizon of conquest. A trumpet sounds faintly in the distance, and soon you spot them, lines of legionaries in gleaming armor, shields clattering, sandals pounding in rhythm. And tucked among their gear, not just weapons and rations, but jars of pickles strapped tight like secret treasures. Roman legions marched on discipline, but they also marched on calories. Grains, dried meats, hard cheeses, and preserved foods filled their packs. And for variety, pickled cucumbers were invaluable. Fresh cucumbers would wilt within days, but brined ones endured, giving soldiers a crunchy, tangy bite long after bread turned stale. It's not hard to picture the relief of a soldier sitting by the campfire, pulling out a jar, and savoring something that still tasted alive. The empire may have been built on strategy and swords, but it was held together, in part, by vinegar. There's a famous Roman saying, "An army marches on its stomach." And while the phrase is often attributed to Napoleon much later, the Romans lived it centuries before. A legionary without food was useless. Salt, vinegar, and pickles were portable stability. Salt kept soldiers hydrated and preserved meat. Vinegar doubled as a drink. Mixed with water it became posca, the Gatorade of the ancient world. Cucumbers in brine, then, were a natural companion, salty, sour, refreshing. And unlike some foods, they didn't require cooking. Just unscrew the wax seal, dig in, and boom, morale. Of course, logistics mattered. Imagine hundreds of jars clinking on mule carts, sloshing with sour liquid, bouncing across uneven roads. Some must have cracked, leaving sticky trails of brine behind. Roman quartermasters probably cursed under their breath as vinegar perfumed the air. But the effort was worth it. Historians still argue whether pickle rations were officially standardized or left up to individual generals, but evidence suggests that wherever legions went, pickles weren't far behind. Here's your quirky tidbit. Pickles weren't just food, they were medicine for the troops. Roman doctors accompanying armies prescribed brined cucumbers for stomach complaints, claiming the sourness cooled fevers and balanced humors. Soldiers who overindulged in wine might gnaw a pickle the next morning, hoping it would steady the stomach. Yes, the Roman army might have invented the hangover cure long before greasy diners and black coffee. Picture a legion camp at night, rows of tents, the air thick with smoke from campfires. Soldiers sit polishing helmets, repairing sandals, gambling with dice, and gnawing on crunchy cucumbers. The sound is comical if you imagine it, an entire army chewing in unison, crunch echoing across the camp. You wonder if any enemy spies ever crept near only to hear an odd chorus of chewing and think, "Ah, the Romans are here." But not every pickle story is glorious. Spoiled brine could spread sickness, and when armies relied heavily on preserved food, one rotten jar could ruin morale. You imagine a centurion barking at the quartermaster, "These cucumbers taste like swamp water," a small crisis amid the greater chaos of empire building. Historians suspect food poisoning occasionally spread through armies, though whether it was from pickles, meat, or poorly kept water remains debated. The symbolism is striking. Rome's unstoppable legions carrying jars of cucumbers. A vegetable so ordinary, yet made extraordinary by the reach of empire. From the Tiber River to Hadrian's Wall, cucumbers marched with the eagle standards. Soldiers conquered provinces by day and chewed sour snacks by night. The image is almost absurd. Mighty Rome, crushing nations, one pickle at a time. And as you trail along the marching column, dust stinging your eyes, you can't help but laugh at the oddity. You thought you'd be witnessing swords clashing, but instead you're surrounded by sweaty men bragging about the crunchiness of last night's cucumber. Yet that's history. It's often less about glory and more about the everyday. And in this case, the everyday was brined, salted, and eaten under the stars. The city hums with morning bustle as you drift toward the Palatine Hill, where marble walls gleam under a soft haze of smoke from bakeries and incense. Inside the imperial palace, servants rush about, silver trays clattering, the air alive with the cloying perfume of roses and, oddly enough, the sharp tang of vinegar. Because here, in the heart of Rome's luxury, an emperor waits impatiently for his pickles. The emperor in question? Claudius, the stammering, scholarly ruler who stumbled into power after Caligula's assassination. History paints him as awkward but clever, underestimated until he proved himself. Yet beneath the marble busts and political decrees, Claudius had a softer, saltier obsession: pickles. Ancient accounts whisper that he demanded them daily, almost ritualistically. Imagine the imperial kitchens scrambling at dawn, cucumbers being hauled in by slaves, vinegar poured into amphorae, spices ground by hand, all to ensure the emperor's cravings were satisfied before his sandals hit the Senate floor. Claudius was not alone in his appetite. Roman emperors often indulged peculiar food fixations. Augustus had a thing for figs, Vitellius was notorious for grotesque banquets, but Claudius's pickle habit feels oddly human. You picture him, robed in imperial purple, listening to senators drone on about taxes in Gaul, secretly daydreaming about the briny crunch awaiting him at lunch. Powerful men can topple nations, but sometimes they just want their cucumbers. The obsession carried weight. When the emperor craved something, supply chains bent to his will. Farmers grew cucumbers specifically for palace demand, traders ferried vinegar from distant provinces, and palace cooks perfected their craft. In a sense, pickle jars became a symbol of imperial logistics. If Rome could move legions across deserts, it could certainly move cucumbers across continents. Still, historians argue whether Claudius's craving was exaggerated by gossip or truly a daily fixation. Did he eat one pickle a day, or entire bowls? We'll never know, but the rumor alone shaped his kitchen. Here's a quirky tidbit. Claudius was also fascinated by medicine and natural science. He wrote treatises, collected odd facts, and loved to experiment. Some scholars suggest his pickle passion was partly medicinal, that he believed sour cucumbers soothed digestion or sharpened the mind. Maybe the emperor didn't just snack out of greed, but because he thought it kept him fit to rule. It's not far-fetched. Remember, Roman doctors prescribed pickles for everything from hiccups to the plague. Imagine the scene. You're a nervous cook in Claudius's palace, clutching a clay jar still warm from sealing wax. You approach the emperor at his midday meal, set it before him, and hold your breath. He lifts a cucumber slice, crunches down, vinegar spraying slightly from his lips. Silence hangs. Then, contentment. A sigh of relief escapes the kitchen staff. Empire preserved, at least until tomorrow's craving. But indulgence sometimes sparked ridicule. Roman elites often mocked each other's food passions. Martial might have teased a senator who loved brine more than wine. A satirist might whisper, "Claudius governs by vinegar." In a culture that balanced excess with moderation, an emperor's appetite was always political fodder. Even pickles could become metaphor, sour cravings reflecting sour governance. Still, food shaped reputation. Claudius, despite being mocked, left behind an image of approachable humanity. He was the emperor who studied history, freed slaves, and yes, munched on cucumbers like any commoner. The oddity is comforting. Rome's vast machinery revolved around emperors, but emperors revolved, sometimes, around their jars. You walk out of the palace, through colonnades where senators bicker and guards polish spears. Behind you, Claudius chews steadily, lost in his vinegar haze. Ahead, the empire churns, laws passed, armies dispatched, roads paved. But in that private chamber, surrounded by jars, one man reminds you how strange and small cravings can ripple into history. Rome wasn't only built on marble and conquest, sometimes it was built on brined cucumbers. The air in Rome thickens with the smell of vinegar and herbs, but now it carries a new weight, not just culinary, but medicinal. You follow the trail into a physician's shop, tucked between a perfumer and a sandal maker, where shelves creak under clay jars. Some hold honey, others oil, and many, predictably, hold pickles. Yes, Roman medicine leaned heavily on cucumbers preserved in brine, because why stop at food when you can make health potions out of snacks? Doctors of the empire believed the body balanced on four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Anything sour, salty, or sharp was thought to cool excess heat or tame fevers. Enter the pickle. Imagine a soldier staggering in after days of marching, stomach knotted from bad water. The doctor frowns, strokes his beard, then prescribes a cucumber floating in vinegar. Eat this, he says, and your humors will settle. Historians still argue whether this was legitimate therapy or just a clever excuse to make soldiers choke down their rations with less complaint. The ailments weren't limited to soldiers. Romans believed pickles could help with hiccups, soothe an upset stomach, and even freshen bad breath. Pliny the Elder records advice like a wellness influencer with a vinegar sponsorship. Cucumbers, he wrote, could prevent excessive thirst if eaten before a banquet. You can almost hear him saying, hydrate better, eat a pickle. Somewhere, a modern sports drink company is weeping at how late they entered the market. Quirky tidbit time: pickles were once suggested as protection against the plague. Imagine that brine as your medieval hand sanitizer. People would nibble cucumbers or sip vinegar brine in hopes of warding off illness. The science, of course, was non-existent, but the faith in food as medicine ran deep. Some believed pickles purified the blood, others thought the sourness scared off evil spirits. You, meanwhile, can't help picturing a terrified Roman clutching a jar like a lucky charm. The role of vinegar added another layer. Romans used vinegar not just in food, but as a cleaning agent, a skin treatment, even a base for a diluted drink called posca. Soldiers slurped it daily, believing it refreshed the body. Adding cucumbers into that acidic world seemed natural. In fact, Roman medical texts often blurred the line between diet and remedy. What you ate was your prescription. Picture now a Roman mother coaxing her child to swallow a sour slice to cure hiccups, promising it works because the doctor said so. Or a senator's wife sipping cucumber-infused brine to calm nerves before a banquet. Did it work? Probably not in the way they believed. But the placebo effect was powerful, and in a world without antibiotics, hope was half the cure. There's even evidence some healers believed cucumbers carried protective coolness from the earth itself. By consuming them, one absorbed a piece of nature's balance. That poetic logic gave ordinary pickles mystical weight. Imagine chewing one slowly, thinking, this briny crunch connects me to the soil, the gods, and maybe, hopefully, a better bowel movement. But as with most Roman practices, contradictions abounded. Other physicians warned that pickles caused indigestion, that too much sourness weakened the body. Scholars still debate whether cucumbers were a universal cure or a risky snack in disguise. The truth probably lay somewhere in between. You step back into the street, the healer's jars fading behind you. Around you, life bustles on, vendors shouting, chariots rattling, children playing. But you carry the image of a society so devoted to its brined cucumbers that even medicine shelves sagged with them. Rome trusted the pickle not just to feed its people, but to heal them. And somehow, that feels stranger than any battle or marble triumph you've seen yet. You drift away from the physician's shop, weaving through the narrow streets until you stumble into a small shrine, half hidden between two larger temples. The marble of Jupiter's grand columns gleams nearby, but here, clay lamps flicker over baskets of grain, honey cakes, and yes, strangely enough, pickled cucumbers laid carefully as offerings. You blink, half wondering if you've taken a wrong turn into a kitchen pantry, but no, these are sacred gifts. Romans saw food not just as sustenance but as a bridge to the divine. If bread could honor Vesta, and wine could please Bacchus, why not cucumbers preserved in brine? Certain deities, those tied to fertility, harvest, and health, were thought to appreciate earthy offerings. And while you won't find an official pickle god in the pantheon, the practice of laying preserved foods before statues shows how deeply everyday life bled into spirituality. Historians still argue whether cucumbers themselves held symbolic weight or if people simply offered whatever they had on hand. Either way, brined vegetables occasionally found their way into Rome's ritual landscape. Quirky tidbit: there are scattered tales of farmers burying jars of pickles in fields to bless the soil. The idea was that the preserved cucumber, steeped in vinegar and salt, carried protective energy against blight and pests. It sounds ridiculous, like throwing a jar of dill pickles into your backyard today and expecting fewer mosquitoes, but for Romans, the boundary between food, medicine, and magic was porous. Festivals brought even stranger sights. During Saturnalia, when roles reversed and slaves feasted alongside masters, tables overflowed with preserved goods. Pickles, durable and plentiful, symbolized continuity in chaos. Imagine a rowdy banquet where everyone is swapping clothes, singing bawdy songs, and crunching on cucumbers, laughing at the absurdity. In a way, the pickle became part of the joke, sour, silly, yet sustaining. Some philosophers tried to rationalize it. They claimed that preservation represented immortality. The cucumber, once doomed to rot, was transformed into something that could last through seasons. To eat a pickle was to consume a little victory over decay. You might scoff, but in a world where death loomed daily, that symbolism carried real comfort. Even a jar in the cellar whispered reassurance. Life continues. Picture a young woman at a fertility shrine, leaving a jar of pickled cucumbers beside garlands of flowers. She whispers a prayer for children, hoping the sour crunch might charm the gods into granting her wish. Another man, before a long journey, places a cucumber slice at Mercury's feet, begging for safe passage. Did the gods nibble? Of course not. But the act of giving something preserved, something enduring, felt like handing over time itself. And here's where the oddity sharpens. Romans sometimes blended cucumber brine into ritual drinks. Imagine sipping vinegar-soaked water in a sacred rite, believing it cleansed not just your stomach but your soul. Was it refreshing? Hardly. But in the hush of candlelight, with chants echoing, the sour burn might have felt like proof of purification. You wander out of the shrine, ears still ringing with murmured prayers, and realize Rome didn't keep sacred and ordinary apart. Even pickles, humble, everyday pickles, could be tokens of the divine. The line between dinner table and altar was thinner than you'd expect. And if you squint, you almost see it, jars glowing softly in the lamplight, vinegar scent rising like incense, cucumbers transformed from snacks into symbols of survival, fertility, and maybe even grace. The morning sun climbs higher as you weave through the forum's bustling arteries, your ears bombarded by the shouts of merchants and the clang of metal coins. The air smells like a strange cocktail: fresh bread, sweaty crowds, roasted meat, and cutting through it all, that sharp, unmistakable sting of vinegar. This is no accident. All around you, amphorae and jars are stacked high, their wax seals glistening. Rome's markets are overflowing with pickles. Vendors call out their wares in sing-song voices, tempting you with olives, dried figs, garum, and cucumbers glistening in brine. Each stall looks like a miniature pickle museum: rows of ceramic jars painted with simple markings, some with handles for carrying, others stout and heavy for storage. You watch a woman dip a ladle into a jar and scoop out slices into a small clay dish, handing it to a boy whose face lights up at the crunch. Pickles weren't fancy. They were everyday snacks, affordable enough that even the poor could manage a taste now and then. Still, the market smelled like a pickle bomb had gone off. Imagine hundreds of jars left open to show their contents: vinegar mingling with spices, dill, coriander, mustard seeds, maybe even garlic. The sour tang clung to your clothes, making you half hungry and half overwhelmed. Historians still argue whether Romans enjoyed this aroma or simply tolerated it, but one thing's certain: the pickle stall was hard to miss. Here's a quirky tidbit: some Roman markets were so flooded with vinegar jars that graffiti artists mocked them. One scrawled note, found on a wall in Pompeii, teases a vendor for watering down his brine. Imagine strolling past a stall and seeing, "Your pickles are weak," carved into the plaster. Turns out Yelp reviews aren't new, they just used chisels instead of smartphones. The marketplace also revealed pickle economics. Clay jars, once emptied, were often reused for oil or wine, but some became so stained with vinegar that their smell never left. Archaeologists today can sometimes identify old pickle jars just by the sour residue crusted in the clay. It's like finding a 2,000-year-old Tupperware container that still reeks of last week's leftovers. The sensory chaos didn't stop at smell. Picture the clatter of lids being pried open, vinegar sloshing, coins exchanged, merchants barking about freshness. Children dart through the crowd munching slices, soldiers haggle for travel rations, and old women sniff critically before agreeing on a price. Pickles weren't background noise here, they were woven into the heartbeat of commerce. But markets carried risk too. A spoiled jar could sicken buyers, and in tightly packed cities, word spread fast. A vendor selling bad brine might find his stall deserted within days. The marketplace wasn't just an economic hub, it was a public stage where reputation lived or died with every sour slice. As you drift deeper into the chaos, you realize the jars aren't just food containers. They're storytellers. Each one holds whispers of harvest fields, of gardens by villa walls, of soldiers on the march, of women praying at shrines. They line the market like soldiers of clay, each heavy with vinegar and history. And then it clicks: Rome's greatness wasn't only built in marble temples or battlefield victories. It thrived in simple exchanges, in jars carried home, in pickles passed around the dinner table, in vinegar-soaked markets that reeked of survival and community. You stand there, the smell burning your nostrils, and think, this empire runs on salt, vinegar, and crunch as much as it does on law and legion. You step away from the market stalls, your tunic still clinging with vinegar scent, and find yourself drifting toward the Senate. The grand hall looms with its marble steps and polished floors, echoing with the sandals of politicians shuffling in to argue. Inside, the air is heavy with incense, perfume, and, if you listen closely enough, whispers about trade routes, taxes, and yes, pickles. Because even here, in the chamber of Rome's most powerful men, brine was serious business. It wasn't cucumbers alone that fueled debate, but the lifeblood of preservation: salt, vinegar, and spices. To make a pickle empire run, Rome needed stable supplies. Salt mines in Ostia, vinegar produced from spoiled wine, pepper and cloves brought from India, these were the ingredients senators squabbled over while pretending to talk about loftier matters. You can almost hear Cicero clearing his throat, insisting on moral virtue, only to pause mid-sentence as another senator hisses, "But what of the spice ships? What of the vinegar casks?" Trade in preserved foods meant wealth, and wealth meant influence. Provinces that produced salt or wine wielded subtle power over Rome's appetite. Merchants grew rich shipping jars of brine across the Mediterranean. Politicians, never shy of corruption, skimmed profits or struck deals to secure exclusive rights. Imagine a senator greasing palms not for gold or marble but for first pick of pickled cucumbers from Hispania. It sounds absurd, yet when food preservation kept armies alive, these arguments carried real weight. Quirky tidbit: some senators mocked each other's palates, accusing rivals of favoring Greek brines or barbarian spices. Picture a dignified debate degenerating into, "Your cucumbers taste foreign," followed by snickers behind togas. It's food politics at its pettiest and somehow very Roman. Historians still argue whether certain spice monopolies genuinely threatened stability or if senators exaggerated for drama, but the tension over trade routes was undeniably real. Beyond politics, preservation touched Rome's identity. The empire prided itself on control of territory, of people, of nature itself. Turning fragile cucumbers into durable snacks was a microcosm of empire. The Senate chambers smelled faintly of incense, but behind the polished speeches lay the sour truth: Rome was obsessed with mastering decay. Picture a heated session, scrolls unfurled, voices rising, marble echoing with shouts. One senator demands new roads to move salt faster. Another protests the high price of vinegar from Egypt. A third insists the spice trade must be protected from pirates. Beneath it all is the quiet knowledge that without preservation, the empire's food supply weakens, and with it, Rome itself. And while these debates raged, ordinary citizens outside simply bought their jars in the marketplace, unaware that the fate of their cucumbers was being hashed out under gilded ceilings. The contrast is almost comical: senators in spotless togas bickering about logistics, while children munch sour slices on the street. You walk out of the Senate chambers into the sunlight, the drone of political voices fading behind you. Rome may be remembered for law codes and roads, but today you've seen another layer: a state run partly on vinegar and salt, sustained by arguments over the most ordinary of foods. Pickle politics weren't petty, they were empire-defining. And you can't help but chuckle at the irony: the mighty Senate, reduced to brining squabbles that smell faintly like your lunchbox. You stroll from the Senate steps into the neighborhood taverns, where marble fades into soot-stained plaster and laughter spills out of doorways. Here, you find Rome's truest love affair, one more pungent than politics and more binding than law: the love of sauces. If there was a liquid that defined the Roman palate, it was garum, that infamous fermented fish sauce. But as you soon notice, garum rarely traveled alone. At many tables, jars of cucumber brine sat nearby, a tangy companion to Rome's most beloved condiment. Garum was everywhere. Made by layering fish guts, salt, and herbs under the Mediterranean sun until it liquefied into a pungent brown elixir, the stuff was ladled into nearly every dish. Bread, vegetables, roasted meat, drizzle some garum on top, and suddenly you had flavor. Modern noses might wrinkle, but to Romans, it was liquid gold. Amphorae of garum were shipped across the empire, labeled with proud stamps from famous factories in Spain or North Africa. To pour a little over your food was to taste Rome's reach. But look a little closer at the tables, and you'll notice something else. The jars of cucumber brine didn't just sit quietly. People would sometimes mix a splash of brine with garum to cut the richness, creating a sharp, tangy-salty sauce hybrid. Imagine dunking your bread into what essentially tastes like Roman salad dressing made from fish guts and pickle juice. Not exactly Caesar salad, but in a way, its ancient ancestor. One quirky tidbit: Pliny the Elder, Rome's encyclopedia-obsessed scholar, claimed garum was good for ulcers, and pickle brine cured hangovers. Put the two together, and you had what some Romans swore was a miracle potion. Picture a bleary-eyed Roman after a night of wine guzzling, stumbling into a tavern and demanding, "Garum with brine, hold the cucumbers." Historians still argue whether this was common practice or just a fringe tavern trick, but it's easy to imagine desperate souls trying anything to soothe their throbbing heads. The strange pairing of garum and pickle brine also revealed something about Roman taste. They craved extremes. Salt, sour, and umami collided on their tongues like gladiators in the Colosseum. Where we might prefer balance, Romans went for intensity. One poet even joked that Roman breath could knock a slave unconscious, a nod to just how pungent these sauces made daily life. Walk further into the tavern, and you see families gathered around steaming bowls. A father dips roasted turnips into garum, then sprinkles pickle juice over the top. His son laughs, making a face at the sour burst. A young woman at another table folds bread into brine-soaked cucumbers, chasing it with a sip of watered wine. The air hums with garlic, fish, and vinegar, mingling into a smell that is both appetizing and alarming. Outside, vendors peddle cheap versions of garum, often watered down or cut with inferior brine. Some customers accuse them of fraud. Others don't care, they just want something salty to spice up their barley porridge. Meanwhile, the wealthy order amphorae of premium garum infused with herbs, insisting their cooks combine it with delicate cucumber brines imported from far-off estates. Even sauce had a class divide, because of course it did. You pause, looking back at the mingling jars. Rome, in many ways, was defined not by its architecture or conquests, but by its appetite for preservation and fermentation. These sauces, garum and pickle brine alike, weren't just condiments, they were symbols of ingenuity, trade, and even identity. When Romans spooned these liquids into their meals, they were tasting empire. And perhaps that's why, even as you leave the tavern and the scents cling to your clothes, you can't shake the thought, history may build statues of emperors, but what truly flavored Rome was fish sauce and pickles. Not marble. Not columns. Just a jar and a ladle, passed hand to hand across centuries. You wander back toward quieter Roman streets, your ears still ringing from the tavern's chorus of clinking cups and fishy laughter, when you notice something unusual etched into the walls: poetry. Not the polished lines of Virgil or Horace carved for posterity, but graffiti scratched by ordinary hands. Some of it praises lovers, some mocks rivals, and some oddly enough mentions cucumbers in brine. That's right, even in verse, Romans couldn't resist sneaking in a pickle or two. Writers of the era often used food as metaphor, and pickles, with their sour punch, made for easy comic targets. Martial, the sharp-tongued satirist, compared certain lovers to oversalted cucumbers, appealing at first bite, regrettable the next morning. Juvenal, meanwhile, tossed around culinary imagery to shame gluttons, hinting that stuffing one's mouth with pickled cucumbers was as shameful as greed itself. You can practically hear the audience chuckling, nudging each other at public readings. That's me after the feast. But poetry wasn't only mockery. Some lighter verses likened pickles to the spice of love, sharp, unexpected, and unforgettable. Imagine a lover whispering, "You are my brined cucumber," which to Roman ears was apparently charming rather than an instant breakup line. Historians still argue whether these food metaphors reflected real passion or were simply poetic flourishes, but either way, the cucumber earned its place in the literary pantry. Quirky tidbit: archaeologists once found wax tablets covered in what seems to be a student's clumsy poem about brining cucumbers. It rhymed badly and made little sense, but the effort shows just how normal the subject was. While today you might get detention for handing in a sonnet about pickles, in Rome it was fair game. The humor extended into plays too. Playwrights loved a cheap laugh, and what's cheaper than slipping on a jar of vinegar or making a pompous character gag on a sour cucumber? It's Roman slapstick at its most vinegary, and audiences roared at the sight. You realize, standing there with scratched graffiti under your fingers, that Romans didn't just eat pickles, they wove them into the texture of their jokes, their courtship, even their laments. Picture a small household after dinner, a father reading aloud Ovid's love poetry by lamplight, children giggling whenever the cucumber metaphor appears, the mother rolling her eyes but smiling. Or a gathering of friends, wine flowing, as one guest recites a bawdy couplet about brine and passion, met with groans and applause. The pickle, humble though it was, became a shorthand for the tang of life itself, funny, sharp, sometimes overwhelming, but never forgotten. As you step away from the graffiti wall, it dawns on you that literature preserves culture just as brine preserves cucumbers. The flavors of Roman humor, love, and satire still seep through the centuries, leaving you with an odd but comforting thought. Long before memes and dad jokes, someone in a toga was already writing punchlines about pickles. You drift away from the playful graffiti and toward the darker side of preservation, the jars that didn't quite turn out right. Because for every crisp, sour, tongue-tingling cucumber that delighted Roman mouths, there were others that sat too long in the heat, their brine turned cloudy, their skins soft and slimy. Rome had a pickle problem, and not all of it was funny. Food safety, as we know it today, didn't really exist. Romans had sharp noses and sharper stomachs, but spoiled jars slipped through. Imagine opening a clay amphora, expecting that familiar tang, only to gag as rancid fumes rise out, stronger than garum itself. Sometimes people risked it anyway. Waste was frowned upon in a city where grain riots weren't uncommon. A sour pickle gone too sour? Just scrape off the top, they thought, and hope for the best. Quirky tidbit: there are ancient jokes about death by cucumber. One satirist claimed a man was so obsessed with pickles that he ate them even when spoiled, collapsing dramatically at a feast. Historians still argue whether this was a comedic exaggeration or based on genuine cases of food poisoning, but the fact remains, not every jar was a treasure. Soldiers, too, faced the gamble. On long marches, amphorae jostled in wagons, lids loosened, brine leaked. By the time the legions cracked open their stores, some jars had turned deadly. A rotten cucumber in the field wasn't just disappointing, it could incapacitate men when strength was needed most. Commanders had to decide whether to trust their supplies or toss them onto the roadside. Somewhere along the Appian Way, you can almost see discarded jars lying cracked, their foul-smelling contents soaking into the dust. For wealthy households, spoiled pickles were an embarrassment. Slaves could be punished for failing to maintain brine properly, accused of negligence if jars went bad. Some manuals even advised double-sealing containers with wax or oil to keep rot at bay. But accidents happened, and in elite villas, rancid jars might be quietly buried in gardens to hide the shame. You wonder how many archaeologists have dug up these failures, puzzling over why some cucumbers look like shriveled shadows rather than crisp relics. And yet, spoilage revealed something essential. Romans were experimenting. Brining was never a perfect science, especially in a climate as hot as Italy's. Too much salt, the cucumbers shriveled. Too little, and bacteria took over. Vinegar ratios varied wildly. It was culinary trial and error on an imperial scale. Even failures taught them lessons, though unfortunately, those lessons were sometimes learned the hard way at dinner tables. You pause, imagining yourself at a Roman feast, handed a cucumber slice that tastes just a little off. Do you politely swallow, or risk insulting your host by spitting it discreetly into your napkin? Neither choice seems safe. Romans prided themselves on boldness, but perhaps the bravest among them were those who chewed through suspect pickles without flinching. The truth is, spoiled pickles are as much a part of history as the perfect ones. They remind you that Rome's greatness was built not on flawless victories or unspoiled jars, but on persistence through mistakes, rotten brine, and all. In the sourness of decay, Rome still found ways to carry forward, though you suspect more than one stomach paid the price. You leave behind the rancid amphorae buried in Roman gardens and follow the sea breeze out of the city. The empire was always on the move, and so were its jars. As Rome expanded, it carried not only legions and laws but also its appetite for brined cucumbers. Soon, the tang of pickle brine seeped into corners of the world that had never seen such jars before. Picture a Roman ship pulling into a Gallic port, amphorae clinking below deck. Soldiers unload crates of armor, bolts of cloth, barrels of wine, and tucked among them, clay jars of cucumbers floating in salty vinegar. The locals peer curiously at this strange cargo. They had their own preservation methods, smoking, drying, salting meats, but cucumbers in brine? That was new. Some tried it, grimacing at the sour shock, while others developed a taste and began to adopt the practice. Within a few generations, Gauls were packing their own gardens' cucumbers into jars, seasoning them with herbs more common to their lands. Rome had planted a culinary seed. Britain, damp and distant, also got the pickle bug. Legionnaires stationed along Hadrian's wall grumbled about the rain but found comfort in familiar flavors from home. Archaeologists have uncovered amphorae shards up there that still carry faint vinegar traces, hinting at how far these jars traveled. You can imagine a weary soldier biting into a pickle slice, squinting into the gray northern mist, and thinking, at least this tastes like Rome. Quirky tidbit: some Roman writers sneered that barbarian cucumbers weren't worth preserving, claiming they grew misshapen or bitter in foreign soil. Yet locals kept experimenting. Historians still argue whether the Roman pickle habit truly changed diets abroad or remained a soldier's indulgence, but traces in pottery and written accounts suggest the brine seeped slowly but surely into provincial kitchens. In the East, Rome encountered regions with their own pickling traditions. Syrians and Egyptians had long preserved vegetables, often with spices unfamiliar to Italians. The fusion was fascinating. Roman brine met Eastern flavors like coriander and cinnamon. The results shocked some palates and delighted others. In this culinary exchange, the pickle became a symbol of Rome's cultural crossroads, both absorbing and reshaping what it touched. You stroll mentally through these lands, noticing how jars adapt to their surroundings. In Gaul, wide-mouthed clay pots are sealed with beeswax. In Britain, amphorae huddle against the cold. In Syria, cucumbers mingle with carrots and turnips, the jars fragrant with desert spices. Rome's empire may have been diverse and often divided, but in the briny clink of jars, you hear a common rhythm. Of course, not everyone welcomed the taste. Some resisted, clinging to their own preservation styles. Yet even resistance left a trace. The very act of mocking Roman cucumbers proved they had made an impression. And centuries later, when the empire itself fractured, the jars remained, passed along like whispers of Rome's palate. As you step off the imagined ship and back onto Roman soil, you realize pickles weren't just food. They were cultural ambassadors, traveling farther than some emperors ever dared, leaving behind tangy fingerprints on distant kitchens. The sour bite of a cucumber in brine was, in its quiet way, the taste of empire. You return from the windswept provinces to the glitter of Rome's villas, where marble courtyards gleam and fountains splash in shaded gardens. Here, pickles are not simply snacks for soldiers or tavern-goers, they are luxury items, refined, experimented with, and flaunted like jewels. If the poor ate pickles to survive, the rich ate them to show off. In elite kitchens, pickle jars looked nothing like the rough amphorae of the marketplace. Instead, glass vessels shimmered with clarity, showing cucumbers bobbing in liquid like emeralds in crystal. Wealthy households prided themselves on not just having pickles, but on presenting them beautifully. You can picture a banquet table, polished silver platters gleaming, and in the center, a jar of cucumbers steeped in golden honey vinegar, the light catching on each slice as guests murmur approval. The flavors, too, were extravagant. Ordinary brine was too plain for aristocratic tastes. Instead, cooks infused jars with dill, fennel, mint, or rare herbs imported from the East. Some experimented with saffron, turning cucumbers a vivid yellow, while others drizzled in honey or date syrup for a sweet-sour profile that would startle the tongue. Quirky tidbit: a rumor persisted that Cleopatra herself swore by honey-brined cucumbers as part of her beauty regimen, though historians still argue whether this was truth or clever Roman gossip to romanticize foreign queens. At feasts, hosts would boast of their brine as much as their wine. Imagine an emperor leaning back, smugly declaring, "These cucumbers were seasoned with cinnamon from Arabia," while a senator's wife raises an eyebrow, unimpressed unless she detects a hint of myrrh. Food, as always, was status, and pickles were part of the arms race of taste. Cooks, often enslaved Greeks trained in the culinary arts, became mad scientists of brine. They tested ratios, invented spice blends, and sometimes even buried jars in cool courtyards to age like fine wine. Guests might debate which estate had the crispest cucumbers or the smoothest vinegar, their voices as earnest as if discussing philosophy. A modern listener might laugh, but in Rome, pickles became another way to show off refinement and wealth. There were even superstitions. Some elites believed luxury brines improved not only digestion but also mood, and a few insisted they could cool the temper of Mars, warding off anger after heated political debates. Others whispered that certain herbs preserved in brine carried aphrodisiac powers. Imagine a patrician slipping a golden slice of honey-brined cucumber across the table to a lover, eyes gleaming in the lamplight. And yet, beneath the gilded glamour, there was the same essence: a cucumber in vinegar, salty, sour, preserved. Whether in the mouth of a soldier on a muddy road or an empress reclining on a couch, the bite was unmistakable. Rome's elite palate may have gilded the pickle, but it never changed its core. As you stroll away from the villa's garden, the scent of rare herbs trailing behind, you can't help but smile. The humble cucumber had risen higher than most men ever dreamed. In the halls of emperors and the mouths of senators, it had become not just food, but fashion. You slip away from the glittering villa, and soon the air grows heavier, quieter. The grand banquet halls fade into ruins, the clatter of amphorae replaced by the silence of a world in decline. Rome is no longer the unstoppable force it once was, and with its cracks, even the pickle jar begins to wobble. As the empire staggered under invasions, plagues, and political chaos, trade routes faltered. Those precious spices from the East, harder to find. The steady flow of salt from certain provinces, interrupted by raiders. Vinegar from spoiled wines was still made, but without consistency, and brine quality suffered. What was once a carefully tuned art in elite villas became haphazard in struggling households. Some jars turned cloudy from poor sealing. Others never got made at all. Pickles, once empire-wide staples, began to vanish from tables as survival replaced luxury. Quirky tidbit: in late Roman texts, you sometimes find complaints about thin brines or cucumbers without sharpness. These weren't just culinary critiques, they were metaphors for decline itself. A weak pickle jar mirrored a weak empire, both lacking bite. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate symbolism or just cranky writers missing their favorite snacks, but the connection is striking. Even the wealthy felt the shift. With estates raided and roads less secure, jars that once glittered with honey and saffron sat empty. Guests at dwindling feasts sighed over bland cucumbers, remembering better days when spices from India or cinnamon from Arabia gave their brine exotic flair. A spoiled jar was no longer just a nuisance, it became a reminder of Rome's fraying control. And yet, the love of pickles never vanished entirely. In provinces, people adapted, using local herbs or stronger vinegars when imports dried up. In Gaul and Britain, brining traditions quietly survived even as Rome's legions marched away. In the East, older preservation styles mingled with Roman habits, ensuring the sour taste lingered long after imperial banners fell. You wander through an abandoned villa courtyard, weeds pushing through cracked marble. A forgotten amphora lies tipped on its side, its seal broken centuries ago. You imagine what it once held: cucumbers steeped in golden brine, perhaps, or an experimental blend lost to time. Now it is only dust and memory. Rome's grandeur, like its pickles, has soured. But decline is never a full stop. Even in the empire's fading days, the tradition of preserving, experimenting, and savoring pickled cucumbers seeded itself into the cultures that followed. The jar might crack, but the recipe endured, passed along like a ghost of empire. As you step back from the ruins, you realize this. Rome's story can be told through marble, battles, and emperors, but it can just as easily be tasted in the tang of a jar that once sat on a common table. The fall of Rome was the fall of many things, but even sour cucumbers left their mark, lingering, sharp, and oddly comforting. You leave behind the quiet ruins and step into a kitchen that feels strangely familiar. The amphorae are gone, replaced by glass jars with metal lids. The marble floors are swapped for tile, the clay ovens for stoves, yet the scent in the air, the sharp tang of vinegar mixed with dill and garlic, reminds you instantly of Rome. The truth becomes clear: Rome never really lost its pickles. They've simply been hiding in your lunchbox. The continuity is astonishing. The Romans packed cucumbers into salty brine. Today you do the same, just with cleaner jars and maybe a little refrigeration to save your stomach from disaster. The soldiers who crunched sour slices on the march wouldn't blink at the jar sitting in your fridge, though they might complain it lacks exotic saffron. Even the pairing with meals endures. Romans bit into brined cucumbers alongside bread and cheese. Modern hands reach for pickles beside sandwiches and burgers. A different table, a different world, but the same tangy echo. Quirky tidbit: Napoleon once offered a prize for new food preservation methods, a quest that led to canning, but even then, pickles never left the picture. They simply adapted, trading clay amphorae for glass, sea salt for factory salt, and sun-baked courtyards for supermarket shelves. Historians still argue whether today's pickles taste closer to Rome's plain soldier rations or the honey-brined delicacies of the elite, but either way, the lineage is undeniable. And here's the oddest part: when you bite into a pickle now, you're not just crunching into a snack. You're tasting empire. You're tasting the hands of Roman cooks experimenting with herbs, senators bickering over spice roots, tavern-goers dunking bread in garum and brine. You're tasting survival, luxury, humor, and failure all bottled up in vinegar. So next time you pop open a jar and that vinegary sting hits your nose, pause for a moment. Let your mind drift to marble halls, bustling markets, marching legions, and the distant laughter of poets making cucumber jokes on wax tablets. The pickle you hold may seem ordinary, but it carries the odd, enduring story of an empire that refused to let cucumbers rot, even as the empire itself eventually did. The crunch echoes across centuries. The story softens, and so does your breath. You feel the sharp tang of vinegar fade into something gentler, the way echoes in stone halls eventually dissolve into silence. The jars, the soldiers, the senators, even the poets with their cucumber jokes, all of them drift slowly into the distance, like lanterns floating on dark water. You let the imagery loosen its hold. The marble floors of villas grow hazy, the clatter of amphorae softens, and the streets of Rome blur into shadows. What remains is only the faintest taste, not sour, not sharp, but strangely soothing. You realize that even in its oddities, history has a rhythm meant to lull you. The same way brine settles and clears in a jar, your thoughts settle now, calm and unclouded. The noise of debates in the Senate falls quiet. The clinking cups in taverns fade away. The smell of garum and vinegar slips from your nose like a dream you won't need to recall. All that's left is the slow, steady comfort of knowing the past has carried itself here, into your hands, into your ears, into the present moment. And with that comfort, you feel the heaviness of your body sink further into stillness. Your eyelids grow slower, heavier, like amphory lids sealing tightly shut. The story of Rome's pickles has wound its way across centuries to reach you here tonight, not with noise or urgency, but with a gentle reminder: everything sharp eventually softens, everything preserved eventually rests. So let yourself rest too. Let the sourness fade, leaving only calm sweetness on your tongue. Good night.